Hi, and thank you very much to Vera for allowing me to come here and highlight this particular sort of research in what she has explained, sort of the theme 4.1. So we're going back to this set of arguments about preferences and about how those preferences influence political behavior and political actions. And in particular, in this research that I'm going to summarize for you in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about immigration and how immigration then may have affected or may affect in some ways both the decline of left parties that we're seeing in some industrialized democracies, in many industrialized democracies, and the rise of populism. And I have to apologize because there are many slides and I'm going to jump over a large number of them. So let me just start by sort of trying to motivate this research a little in terms of some following very closely from one of the things that Vera was talking about. This idea that globalization is this challenge that produces sort of winners and losers, and that therefore sort of an important part of the political story that both sort of causes and the consequences of globalization have to do with the provision of compensation. So again, sort of this idea that globalization may produce winners and losers, but that then sort of you, through tax and transfers and other policies, you in fact sort of take some from the winners and compensate the losers, and that is sort of a sustainable sort of political system. And here, sort of immigration and ethnic diversity, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next 20 minutes, is this idea that there is this challenge because the diversity, ethnic diversity, lack of homogeneity impedes in some ways the kind of support for redistribution that would allow for this compensation to take place. So we have a number of arguments of this in political economy and in political science, that a comprehensive welfare state is possible or was possible in Western Europe because of homogeneous societies. This is the Alesina and Glaser sort of famous argument. And that heterogeneity in populations, in effect, sort of challenges, undermines these welfare politics by making the poor less likely to support redistribution, less likely to support the kinds of policies that benefit them in terms of their material self-interest. So if this is the case about demand for redistribution, what about voting for a distributive party? So we're going to be sort of looking at both sort of the demand for distribution, but whether then that demand turns into voting, sort of voting behavior. And in particular for this sort of challenge, this particularly important challenge for the left, which is the sort of what has been called in some of this literature the new progressive dilemma, right? So how to preserve a comprehensive or a generous welfare state in a multicultural society without losing this public support for the welfare state, particularly in times of economic hardship or economic austerity. And one of the possibilities is to sacrifice multiculturalism and or the welfare state, or so to in fact sort of become more anti-immigration while trying to preserve the generosity of the welfare state, or in fact the other way around, sort of just sacrificing the generosity of the welfare state. And is this then sort of an electoral sort of opportunity then for populism if in fact sort of this dilemma for the left turns out to be a complicated one electorally? So there's sort of four variables that I'm just going to go over sort of very quickly with you, and two relationships that sort of matter to this, and you can see them there in the slide. It is essentially sort of a question, because compensation has to do with the rich and the poor, winners and losers, the people who support redistribution and pay for redistribution, and the people who then benefit from redistribution. It is something related to relative income, so how are the poor and the rich differently affected by this? It then has also to do with population heterogeneity, intervening in between the relative income and support for redistribution, these redistribution preferences. So is it the case that the poor or the rich are then affected in terms of their demand for redistribution by being in places with high levels of immigration or with high levels of ethnic diversity? And then finally, the second relationship is whether these redistribution preferences actually affect voting, right? So even if it is in fact the case that immigration intervenes in between relative income and redistribution preferences, is it in fact the case that demand for redistribution affects how individuals then vote for redistributive parties? So let me give you, this is just plugging in. This is all from this new book coming out in July with Daniel Steckmuller, and I think that you can pre-order it in Amazon already. It makes, just a suggestion, it would make a great Christmas present for several members of the family. So let me just give you sort of a very simple sort of 4 sets of relationship, or how these relationships that we've just talked about in the previous, the ones that you see at the bottom of that slide, what kind of world they could imply. And then I'll just sort of give you a very sort of preliminary kind of analysis of the empirics to see which one of these very schematic and sort of idealized relationships we can in fact see in the data. We could have a world in which immigration and ethnic diversity make no difference whatsoever, right? And in here we just have, I'm going to show you these sort of graphs that are very simple, and they involve sort of a very simple relationship between your income and your support for distribution, right? And we're just going to start from a very sort of simple point in which the more affluent you are, the more you pay for redistribution, and therefore the lower your support for distribution is going to be. In, again, sort of a very sort of loose and sort of general sense, right? So we could have this kind of negative slope that you see here. The higher your income in the x-axis, the more you're moving to the right, the lower your support for redistribution. But there would be no difference between being in a place with a high level of immigration and in a place with a low level of immigration. We would look at the data and we would see a very similar relationship, whether there is a very high level of diversity, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, or not, right? That we could be in that world in which immigration is a non-issue. We just have the general relationship between your relative income and your support for distribution. We could also be in a world in which there is something about ethnic homogeneity that makes everybody more likely to support redistribution, right? So this is one of the interpretations of the sort of original argument of Alesina and Glaser, explaining why it is that you have a generous welfare state in homogeneous Europe and not so generous a welfare state in heterogeneous USA. So in here, everyone, right, sort of in some ways is more supportive of redistribution when you are in a place that is more homogeneous. So we have these 2 lines. We still have the general sort of negative effect of relative income. You are less likely to support redistribution if you are more affluent, if you have a higher income in the x-axis. But now we have 2 kinds of different situations, 2 kinds of different countries, or 2 times, different times for one country, in which if homogeneity goes up or if heterogeneity goes down, there is more support for distribution in general. And what we would observe then is in countries where immigration grows or ethnic heterogeneity grows, there is a general decrease in support for distribution, and that line just moves down. You still have a difference between the rich and the poor, but it's the same. It just goes down or it goes up depending on homogeneity or heterogeneity. Then we could have this other kind of world in which, in fact, the difference is all about the poor and not about the rich, right? So that the rich are not affected by immigration, they see the advantages of immigration, but it is the poor that dislike immigration, that have a reaction to immigration, even though they, in fact, benefit from redistribution in a material self-interest way because of the dislike of the outgroup or because of the consequences of immigration. We could live in a world in which the higher the ethnic diversity, the higher the level of immigration, the less the support of the poor, but no difference for the rich. And finally, we could live in this kind of world in which immigration makes more of a difference to the affluent than it makes to the poor. Right? And this is the argument that Daniel Steckmuller and I make. We make the argument that for the poor, the benefits of redistribution are important enough so that immigration or dislike of outgroup or the things that we associate with that are trumped by the economic benefits of redistribution because they want to be in a system in which the rich are taxed and they get benefits and therefore there is compensation. For the rich, however, who are the ones who contribute to the redistribution by paying for it, this kind of homogeneity matters, and for them it makes, they have higher support for redistribution when in fact the poor are like them. right? So if you divide sort of this world into in-group and out-group, the higher the heterogeneity, the more unlike the rich is from the poor, the less likely the rich is to support redistribution. And we could live in this kind of world. So we now have these 4 different kinds of, and we are going to look at some preliminary sort of data to see whether this is, which one actually is picked up by the empirics, and also more importantly, not only in terms of the demand for redistribution, but then on that demand for redistribution influencing voting, and voting for redistributive parties in particular. So we look at 2 different, in this particular presentation that I'm doing for you, I'm just going to show you data from 2 sources, the European Social Survey from 2002 to 2008, and the General Social Survey in the US. So we're going to look at sort of Western European data, and we're going to look at American data. Now, I'm not going to give you sort of the details of many of these things, but I am going to, so we're measuring relative income, we are measuring preferences. Let me just show you, this is the preferences. So these are the questions, right? Sort of the way in which we measure whether you support redistribution or not are these questions in the surveys that are used in the literature for support for redistribution all the time. This question about the government should take measures to reduce differences in income levels, and then you agree or disagree with that. And in the General Social Survey in the US, the government should reduce income differences between the rich and the poor, perhaps by raising the taxes of wealthy families or by giving income assistance to the poor. Then we look at your income, and we measure heterogeneity, right? And we're going to measure population heterogeneity in 2 different ways. In Europe, we're going to measure heterogeneity as immigration, this share of foreign-born population. And in the States, we're going to measure heterogeneity as the share of African Americans living in a household receiving welfare. So these 2 are slightly different, and they have different implications for the kind of argument we want to make, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later. But these are going to be our, again, sort of rough and ready sort of measures of high degrees of heterogeneity or low degrees of heterogeneity in your state or in your region, because we don't use the national sort of numbers, but the regional ones, and therefore whether that makes a difference to your support for redistribution. Now, these are the predicted probabilities for supporting redistribution preferences. So we're still in the sort of the first relationship. Do you support redistribution or not? And this is now when we try to reproduce empirically the relationship that I showed you before in terms of the theoretical expectation of what this relationship could be. So in the x-axis, we have income, and in the y-axis, we have how likely you are to support redistribution. And as you can see, for the poor, being in a country with a low or a high share of foreigners doesn't make much of a difference. You always have a high level of support for redistribution. You are, 75% likely to support redistribution. Your support for redistribution goes down as you become more affluent, right? So as your income distance to the mean in your country goes up, your relative income is going up, you're becoming more affluent, your support for redistribution goes down. But there is a very significant difference between the affluent who live in very homogeneous places and the affluent who live in less homogeneous places. So that your support for redistribution as an affluent person, when you are in a more homogeneous place, does in fact go up, is higher than if you are in a heterogeneous place. So in the American analysis, we look at race rather than immigration, and we do something very similar. And this was also because sort of we presented our Western European results a lot of times in the US, and they always told us in the US, well, that's Europe, but that's not going to be the case in the States. But in the States, it's exactly the same, right? So in here, we have the low share of black welfare recipients at the state level and the high share of black welfare recipients at the state level. Again, we have income in the x-axis, and we have your support for distribution, the likelihood of supported redistribution in the y-axis. And again, we see that for those who are poor, the differences are minimal. So if you are in a place with high levels or low levels of heterogeneity in the States, your support for distribution is high, and it is not affected by being in these different states. However, as you become more affluent, just like in Western Europe, that difference, the effect of heterogeneity on your support for redistribution is significant, and you become much more likely at the same level of income, right? At the same level of being rich, you become more likely to support redistribution if you are in a state that is more homogeneous. All right, so that is all in terms of support for redistribution. Very quickly, how much time? 5 minutes. I'm just going to the big question here is, okay, so this is support for redistribution, and this is support for redistribution in surveys, and it's in this kind of cheap talk. People sort of ask you in a survey, do you support redistribution? And therefore, sort of you say, yes, I support. But, and of course, even then, right, sort of it would be interesting that sort of this cheap talk has these particular characteristics that somehow sort of the rich are systematically different in some places than others to engage in this particular exercise. But nevertheless, the question is, does this have actual consequences in terms of people's voting? So what we do is to look at voting for redistributive parties and correlating, seeing if there is a relationship between individual demand for redistribution and your likelihood to support a redistributive party. Now, I'm going to show you, we also do this in the US, but I'm only going to show you the Western European ones. We, again, use the European Social Survey, which has questions about what party you voted for in the last election. We do a number of things that I'm not going to talk about in great detail. We have a complication in terms of what we want to do, which is how do we define redistributive parties? And in this particular research, we do it in two ways. We look at redistributive parties in terms of the party label, the family that a party belongs to, and if you're in a social democratic or more leftist party and you vote for them, we consider that you voted for a redistributive party. But then we have a more specific way of looking at redistributive parties by looking at what they've promised you in an election. So we look at the party manifesto data, and we then sort of find what the average redistributive offering from a party is, and everyone over that average would become a redistributive party. So we have those two different ways of looking at it. And these have consequences over which parties we consider redistributive, right? So if we look at party labels in Spain or the UK here, we then find that these two different ways at some points when new parties come in that are more redistributive may in fact make a difference, but I'm not going to talk about that in great detail. I'm just going to go to the sort of the punchline here. The simplest way and the sort of the least sophisticated way of looking at this, and we do other different things in the book that I'm happy to talk about, is to simply look at the relationship between redistribution preferences and voting for a redistributive party. And this is what we find when we look at this relationship in Europe. It is this correlation, sort of the higher your redistributive preferences here in the x-axis, the more likely you are to vote for a redistributive party, right? So your redistributive preferences are a significant factor in determining whether you vote for a redistributive party or not. It is something that matters to your voting. So here we have a change in the demand for distribution from 3.5 to 4.5, which is this standard deviation change around the mean, increases the likelihood of voting for a redistributive party from around 40% to 50%, and the likelihood of voting for a left party, the label kind, from 47 to 58%. So these are sort of significant changes in terms of your likelihood to vote for a redistributive party. We do the same thing in the US, and in the US we have here a change in the demand for distribution from 3 to 5, and in here we only have one definition of being a redistributive party, is whether you vote for the Democratic Party or not. We don't have the two ways of looking at it. It increases the likelihood of voting Democrat from around 40 to 60% for an American respondent. So again, sort of we think that this is an important part of this story. Now, I just want to conclude, we do sort of a lot of complicated things. I want to conclude by going back to this progressive dilemma, and do redistribution preferences and redistributive voting help explain this kind of disastrous decline of European center left, as Sherry Berman mentioned in her New York Times opinion piece, or whether this decline has created this space for a populist right whose commitment to liberalism and even democracy is questionable. So I think we show in our work that immigration matters to redistribution preferences and to voting for redistributive parties. And it is also the case that sort of main left parties in industrialized democracies are not as redistributive as they used to be when you look at the policies they promote or the policies they promise in their party manifestos. And that populist right parties have become more redistributive, and populist left parties have, in fact, emerged. Let me just show you two more things, and then I'll shut up. This is the first one, which has to do with the position of the sort of mean left party position and the mean right party position from 1975 to 2000, taking industrialized democracies in general and just looking for an average. As what you can see here is that the mean right position has become sort of more right-wing, but also that the mean left party position has become less redistributive and more centrist and more right-wing throughout this period of time. So there is something about now the demand for redistribution being there, but perhaps the supply side of redistribution not being there. And just going back to also the previous slide about parties in the UK and in Spain, in here we can see how UKIP has become more redistributive over time in a very significant way. I think if we looked at the National Front in France, we would find something quite similar. But we also see the emergence of these populist parties that are very redistributive, and that therefore also the populist challenge in some way to the main left and the main parties in general is one that is related to redistribution and this demand for compensation when facing sort of the challenges of globalization. And I'll stop there.